You've entered void of rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple. Subscribe. We're almost at 5,000 corrupted souls, but the void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion, or face the consequences of defying the void? Now let's jump into today's story. The basement archives of the Whitmore City Library existed in perpetual twilight. Fluorescent bulbs hummed overhead, casting their sterile glow across endless rows of filing cabinets that stretched into shadows thick as velvet curtains. Down here, 3 levels beneath the main library floor, the living world felt like a distant memory. This had been my sanctuary for 12 years, a place where I could lose myself in the meticulous work of cataloguing the dead. My name is Thaddeus Mirek, and at 37 I had grown not just comfortable with solitude, but dependent on it. The musty perfume of aging paper, the whispered conversations between settling floorboards and creaking shelves, the gentle percussion of my fingers against typewriter keys. These sounds had become the symphony of my existence. Every morning, I descended those concrete steps like a priest entering his temple, ready to commune with the spirits, preserved in manila folders and bound volumes. Most people found my work morbid. "How can you spend your days with death certificates and obituaries?" my cousin Rita would ask during our increasingly rare phone calls. But she didn't understand the peace I found in these records. Each certificate told a complete story, a life reduced to essential facts, a human existence distilled into dates, locations, causes, and official signatures. There was honesty in death records that the living world lacked. No pretense, no deception, just the final, unalterable truth. I kept my father's death certificate in the top drawer of my desk, filed under M for Mirek, though I knew every word by heart. Daniel Mirek, age 34. Cause of death: blunt force trauma resulting from industrial accident. Time of death: 3:17 p.m. The paper had grown soft and pliable from decades of handling, like cloth worn thin by worried fingers. I was 8 when the crane operator's cable snapped, sending a steel beam crashing down onto the construction site where my father worked. 29 years later, I still wondered what his last thought had been. Did he see it coming? Did he think of me? My days followed a rhythm as precise as a metronome. I arrived at the library each morning at 6:30, an hour before the building officially opened. Mrs. Carmichael, the head librarian, had given me my own key years ago, understanding that my work required solitude. I would descend to my basement kingdom, brew coffee in the small kitchenette tucked between the rare books vault and the microfilm storage room, and begin my daily communion with the departed. The Whitmore City Library housed the most comprehensive mortality records in the tri-state area. Birth certificates, death certificates, obituaries, coroner reports, cemetery plot records, funeral home logs. If it documented the end of a human life, it eventually found its way to my filing systems. I had developed my own organizational methods over the years, cross-referencing deaths by date, cause, location, and a dozen other categories that helped researchers trace family histories or medical professionals identify patterns in public health. My apartment was a 6-block walk from the library, through streets that grew progressively quieter as the day aged into evening. The 3rd floor of a converted Victorian house, it consisted of 3 rooms and a bathroom, furnished with the sparse efficiency of a man who spent most of his waking hours elsewhere. Winston, an enormous orange tabby cat I'd inherited from the previous tenant, served as my only regular companion. He had the peculiar habit of sitting perfectly still for hours, watching me work at my kitchen table, where I often brought projects home, as if he understood the solemnity of cataloguing the dead. The first time I woke at exactly 2:46 a.m, I attributed it to stress. The library had recently received a massive donation from the estate of Dr. Cornelius Whitmore, the city's founder, whose personal collection included mortality records dating back to the 1800s. Hundreds of documents required careful examination, authentication, and integration into our existing systems. I'd been working 12-hour days for weeks, and my sleep patterns had grown erratic. But when I woke at precisely 2:46 a.m. for the second night, then the third, and then every night for a full week, I began to suspect something more troubling was occurring. Each awakening was identical. One moment I was deeply asleep, the next I was sitting bolt upright in bed, completely alert, as if someone had spoken my name. The red digits of my alarm clock always showed the same time, 2:46. My apartment felt different during these nocturnal awakenings. The familiar sounds of settling wood and distant traffic seemed muffled, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Shadows fell at wrong angles, creating shapes that shouldn't exist in a room lit only by the amber glow of streetlights filtering through worn curtains. Winston began exhibiting strange behavior, refusing to enter my bedroom after sunset. I would find him in the kitchen each morning, pressed against the far wall, his yellow eyes fixed on the hallway with an intensity that made my skin crawl. By the end of the second week, I had developed an almost superstitious dread of going to bed. I tried reading until exhaustion overtook me, hoping to fall into such a deep sleep that whatever internal alarm clock was waking me would fail to function. I tried drinking wine, taking melatonin, even sleeping in different rooms. Nothing worked. Every night at exactly 2:46 a.m, I would find myself wide awake and inexplicably alert. On the 15th night, I discovered why. I woke at 2:46, as had become my cursed routine, but this time the familiar geometry of my bedroom had changed. A tall, narrow figure sat motionless in a wooden chair positioned at the foot of my bed. The chair was antique, carved from dark wood, with a high back and ornate armrests. Definitely not a piece of furniture I owned. More disturbing still, I distinctly remembered checking the bedroom before retiring, and the space where the chair now sat had been empty. The figure wore a black coat that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, cut in the formal style of Victorian mourning dress. His skin had the pale, waxy quality of old candles, stretched taut over sharp cheekbones, and a prominent jaw. Long fingers rested on the chair's armrests, so still they might have been carved from the same dark wood. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries, each word measured and deliberate. "I'm here earlier than expected, Thaddeus." Terror locked my vocal cords. I wanted to scream, to leap from the bed, to do anything that might break the spell of this impossible moment. Instead, I found myself paralyzed, able only to stare into the figure's dark eyes, which reflected the red glow of my digital clock like pools of blood. "Do not be afraid," he continued, his tone patient and strangely gentle. "We have much to discuss before your time comes, and I find that fear makes these conversations unnecessarily difficult." After several attempts, I managed to force words through my constricted throat. "Who are you?" The figure tilted his head slightly, a gesture that might have been amusement on a living face. "I think you already know, though perhaps not at a level you're prepared to acknowledge. You have spent your adult life surrounded by the evidence of my work. Every certificate you file, every obituary you catalogue, every death record you preserve, bears witness to my presence in this world." The realization struck me like ice water flooding my veins. "Your death." He inclined his head with the formal politeness of a gentleman accepting an introduction. "I am, and you, Thaddeus Mirek, present me with a most unusual and troubling problem." Death, for I could no longer think of him as anything else. settled back in his chair with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had every right to be there. Over the next 2 hours, he explained my situation with the patience of a professor delivering a lecture to a particularly slow student. According to Death, there existed what he called the Great Ledger, a cosmic record where every soul was documented, along with their precise moment of departure from the mortal realm. These appointments were determined by forces far beyond human understanding, calculated according to variables that encompassed everything from genetic predisposition to random chance, from moral choices to pure statistical probability. Think of it as the universe's accounting system, Death explained. Every life represents a transaction that must eventually be balanced. The ledger records not just when each soul will be collected, but the circumstances of that collection, the ripple effects on surrounding lives, even the precise second when the spark of existence extinguishes. The system, he assured me, was generally infallible. Mistakes occurred perhaps once in a billion entries, clerical errors so rare they were considered statistical impossibilities. Unfortunately, I was one of those impossibilities. Your entry contains a significant error, Death continued, his dark eyes never leaving my face. According to the ledger, your soul is scheduled for collection on November 15th of this year. However, cross-referencing with the master calculations reveals that your actual appointment should be November 15th, 2087. Someone transposed the digits when making the original entry. The implications hit me slowly, like cold seeping through thick cloth. You're saying I'm supposed to die in 2 months, but I should actually live another 62 years? Precisely. And therein lies the problem. The ledger has achieved a kind of cosmic momentum. It has been in existence since the dawn of human awareness of mortality. When an error of this magnitude occurs, it creates what we might call temporal resonance. The approaching date of your recorded death exerts a gravitational pull that draws me to you, regardless of the error's discovery. What does that mean for me? Death's expression grew solemn. It means that every night, as the date draws closer, I will be compelled to visit you. My presence in the mortal realm creates certain side effects, and ultimately someone must answer for the error. Either the ledger is corrected through proper administrative channels, a process that could take decades, or the debt is paid as originally recorded. When morning came, I almost managed to convince myself the entire encounter had been an elaborate nightmare, brought on by too much work and too little sleep. Almost. The wooden chair was gone, but 4 perfect indentations in the carpet marked where it had stood, pressed deep into the pile, as if it had rested there for years, rather than hours. At the library that day, I found concentration impossible. Every shadow seemed to conceal watching eyes. Every creak of the old building's joints sounded like footsteps. But it was during my lunch break that I first witnessed the side effects Death had mentioned. I was working on a particularly fragile batch of 19th century death certificates, documents that had survived civil war, 2 world wars, and decades of improper storage. These papers represented irreplaceable historical records. Some were the only existing documentation of entire family lines. I'd handled thousands of similar documents over the years, always with the utmost care. But as I lifted the first certificate from its protective sleeve, the paper began to disintegrate under my fingers. Not the gradual decay I might expect from documents exposed to moisture or heat, but an immediate and complete dissolution. The ink faded as if being erased by an invisible hand. The paper crumbled to dust, and within seconds, a document that had survived over a century was reduced to nothing more than a small pile of grey powder on my desk. I stared at the remnants in shock, then carefully attempted to handle the next document. The same thing happened, and the next, and the next. By the end of my lunch break, I had inadvertently destroyed an entire collection of irreplaceable historical records simply by touching them. Winston, the library's elderly tabby who had been my companion for years, provided the next disturbing confirmation of my changing condition. The cat had always been friendly, winding around my legs and purring whenever I entered the main library areas. But that afternoon, when I climbed the stairs to retrieve a reference book, Winston took one look at me and fled. His orange fur stood on end, his back arched, and he released a yowl of pure terror before disappearing behind the circulation desk. The walk home that evening revealed the true extent of what was happening to me. The memorial garden behind the library, carefully maintained by volunteers and blooming with late-season roses, withered as I passed. Flowers that had been vibrant and healthy that morning turned black and brittle, their petals falling to the ground like tears. A squirrel that had been foraging near the garden's edge convulsed once and lay still. Even the grass beneath my feet yellowed and died, leaving a trail of dead vegetation in my wake. At the bus stop where I sometimes waited for the evening route home, Mrs. Henderson sat on the bench reading a paperback romance novel. She had been taking the same bus every weeknight for as long as I had worked at the library, a routine so consistent I could set my watch by her presence. We had never spoken beyond polite nods of acknowledgement, but she had become one of the few constants in my carefully ordered world. As I approached the bus stop, Mrs. Henderson looked up from her book and smiled the same greeting she had offered for years. Then her expression changed. Her eyes widened, her face went pale, and she clutched at her chest with both hands. The paperback fell from her fingers as she pitched forward, landing face first on the concrete sidewalk. I knelt beside her, checked for a pulse, called for an ambulance, but even as I performed these futile gestures, I knew she was gone. The paramedics who arrived 12 minutes later confirmed what I already understood. Massive heart attack, no obvious cause, probably instantaneous death. Standing in the red and blue glow of the emergency lights, watching them load Mrs. Henderson's body into the ambulance, I finally accepted what was happening. Death's nightly presence was contaminating my waking hours, turning me into a walking plague that killed with proximity alone. That night, Death returned to his chair at exactly 2:46 a.m. This time I was ready with questions. "You're killing innocent people," I accused him without preamble. Death regarded me with something that might have been sympathy. Not intentionally. My extended presence in the mortal realm creates what you might call spiritual contamination. The boundary between life and death becomes permeable in my vicinity, and that effect transfers to those I visit regularly. Some souls, particularly those already weakened by age, illness, or emotional distress, cannot withstand the exposure. "Then leave me alone. I cannot." His voice carried genuine regret. "Until the ledger error is corrected or the debt is paid, I'm bound to these visits by forces beyond my control. Think of it as gravity. I no more choose to appear here each night than a stone chooses to fall when dropped." How many more people are going to die because of this? That depends entirely on how long the error remains unresolved. Death paused, studying my face with ancient eyes. "Tell me about your father, Thaddeus." The change of subject caught me completely off guard. What does my father have to do with anything? You keep his death certificate in your desk drawer. You read it every day, sometimes multiple times. Even now, 29 years after his death, you carry his last moments with you like a stone in your chest. Why? I found myself answering despite my fear and anger. I was 8 when he died. Construction accident, a cable snapped and a steel beam fell on him. I've spent my entire adult life working with death records, but I've never been able to understand what happened in those final seconds. Whether he saw it coming, whether he was afraid, whether he thought about me. Death nodded slowly, as if my answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "He did think of you, Thaddeus, In the 2.3 seconds between the cable's failure and the beam's impact, your face was the last image in his mind. He tried to speak your name, but there wasn't time for the words to form. Tears I hadn't shed in decades began to flow freely. How can you possibly know that? Because I was there. I am present at every human death, from the infant who takes no breath to the centenarian who slips away in peaceful sleep. I witnessed the final thoughts, the last words, the moment when the soul separates from flesh. Your father's passing was particularly poignant. He felt not fear, but regret. Regret that he would not see you grow up, would not teach you to drive or help you with homework, or walk you down an aisle someday. Did he suffer? Physical pain? No, the impact was too massive and too sudden for conscious suffering. But emotional pain? Yes. The same pain you carry now, the agony of separation, of love interrupted by forces beyond our control. Over the following weeks, our nightly conversations became the strangest comfort I had ever known. Death spoke of my childhood with perfect clarity, describing moments I had forgotten and others I thought no one could have witnessed. He knew about the ritual I had developed after my father's funeral, lying in bed each night and counting my heartbeats to make sure I was still alive. He described the recurring nightmare that plagued my teenage years, in which I stood on the construction site and watched the beam fall in slow motion, helpless, to warn my father. He even knew about the photograph I kept hidden in my bedroom closet, the last picture taken of my father and me together at my 8th birthday party just 2 weeks before the accident. You have spent your adult life trying to understand death intellectually, Death observed during one of our conversations. You catalogue it, file it, organise it into neat categories, as if understanding the paperwork might somehow explain the mystery. But death is not an intellectual exercise, Thaddeus. It is the most emotional experience a soul can undergo, the ultimate expression of love's vulnerability to time. But even as I found strange solace in these midnight discussions, the contamination was spreading. The library's maintenance staff discovered that every plant in the building, ficus trees, peace lilies, even the hardy spider plants that had thrived for decades, had died overnight. The deaths weren't gradual. Security cameras showed the plants literally withering in real time as I walked through the building. My presence became a death sentence for any living thing nearby. 3 people died during routine encounters with me that week. Mr. Garrett, who ran the newsstand where I bought my morning coffee, collapsed while making change and never got back up. A young mother pushing a stroller past my apartment building suffered a massive aneurysm and died instantly on the sidewalk. Most heartbreaking of all, Mrs. Chen from the apartment below mine was found dead in her kitchen, apparently having suffered a stroke while cooking dinner for her grandchildren, who were visiting for the weekend. I tried desperately to escape the spreading curse. I took sick leave from the library and drove to my cousin Rita's house in Cleveland, hoping that distance might break whatever connection was drawing death to me. But at exactly 2:46 a.m, I woke to find him sitting in a kitchen chair beside the couch where I was sleeping, shaking his head with patient disappointment. Geography is irrelevant, Thaddeus. The connection between us exists outside the normal constraints of space and time. I checked into a motel on the outskirts of the city, registering under a false name and paying cash to avoid leaving any trail. Death appeared in the bathroom mirror at 2:46, his reflection somehow more solid and present than my own. In desperation, I attempted to stay awake for 72 hours straight, reasoning that if I never fell asleep, death couldn't visit my dreams. I consumed energy drinks and caffeine pills, slapped myself awake whenever I felt consciousness slipping, even resorted to playing loud music and doing jumping jacks in my apartment. But human endurance has limits, and on the 3rd night I collapsed at my kitchen table, unconscious before my head hit the surface. I woke in my bed at 2:46 a.m. to find death waiting patiently in his usual chair. "You cannot outrun what is written in the ledger," he told me after each failed escape attempt. "The error must be corrected through proper channels, or the debt must be paid as recorded. Those are the only two possibilities." "How long do I have?" "The original entry specifies November 15th. Today is October 28th. 18 days remain." After a month of nightly visitations, Death's demeanour underwent a subtle but unmistakable change. He appeared in his chair as always, but his voice carried a finality that made my blood freeze in my veins. "Tomorrow night will be our final conversation, Thaddeus. The ledger must balance, and administrative correction is no longer possible within the time constraints. A choice must be made." "What kind of choice?" "The debt recorded in your name must be paid. Either you fulfill the original entry by surrendering your soul on November 15th, or another soul is offered in your place. The ledger cares nothing for identity, only that the cosmic equation remains balanced." The ultimatum sent me into a spiral of panic and desperate moral calculation. I spent the day considering possibilities, my mind racing through potential candidates like a gambler evaluating cards. My landlord, Edmund Cross, seemed the most obvious choice. He was in his 70s, had no family that I knew of, and had made my life miserable with constant rent increases and petty harassment. Surely the world would be no poorer for his absence, but then I thought about his daily routine, the way he fed stray cats behind the building every morning, the care he took maintaining the small garden in the courtyard, the fact that he always cleared snow from the sidewalk before any of his tenants had to ask. Perhaps his gruff exterior concealed a kinder soul than I had credited him with possessing. My supervisor at the library, Patricia Holmes, represented another possibility. She had made my professional life a series of small humiliations, treating me as if I were barely competent. Despite my 12 years of exemplary service, she criticized my methods, questioned my decisions, and seemed to take genuine pleasure in pointing out minor mistakes. But even as I contemplated her potential sacrifice, I remembered the photographs on her desk. Grandchildren she spoke about with obvious love, a husband recovering from cancer treatments, elderly parents who depended on her for care. As the day wore on, I found myself studying strangers with predatory calculation. The rude businessman who cut in line at the coffee shop, snapping at the teenage barista over the temperature of his latte. The woman who let her dog relieve itself on the library's front steps, ignoring the sign requesting pet owners to use the designated area. The group of teenagers who vandalized park benches and left trash scattered across the memorial garden. But every time I mentally selected a victim, the same images haunted me. Another 8-year-old child learning that his father wouldn't be coming home, another spouse becoming a widow overnight, another family destroyed by forces beyond their comprehension or control. The weight of potentially inflicting my own childhood trauma on innocent people became unbearable. By evening, I had reached a decision that surprised me with its clarity. At 11:30 p.m. on November 14th, I walked through the empty streets to Greenlawn Cemetery where my father was buried. The night was unnaturally still. No wind disturbed the bare branches of the oak trees, no insects chirped in the dead grass. Even the distant hum of traffic seemed muted and far away. The cemetery gates, which should have been locked, stood open as if someone had been expecting my arrival. I made my way through rows of weathered headstones to the simple granite marker that bore my father's name. Thaddeus Mirek, beloved father, 1,958 to 1,992 inches. I had visited this grave perhaps a dozen times over the years, but tonight it felt different, less like a memorial to the past and more like a doorway to whatever came next. Death was waiting among the headstones, no longer bothering with the pretense of appearing in my bedroom. His dark coat blended seamlessly with the shadows between the monuments, and his pale face seemed to glow with its own cold light. For the first time in our weeks of conversation, he looked genuinely solemn. "You have made your choice," he said, though I hadn't yet spoken. "I won't condemn another person to die in my place," I replied, kneeling beside my father's grave and placing my hand on the cold granite. "I've spent 29 years as an emotional orphan, afraid to love anyone because they might be taken away. Maybe it's time to stop being afraid of joining him." Death approached slowly, his footsteps making no sound on the frost-covered grass. "Your nobility is noted and appreciated, Thaddeus, but you misunderstand the nature of the choice before you." "What do you mean?" "The ledger has rules, ancient and immutable, but those rules contain loopholes for those who know how to find them." Death knelt beside me, his presence radiating cold that seemed to seep through my skin and settle in my bones. "Another has already been selected, one whose time was always destined to be brief, whose passing will cause minimal disruption to the cosmic order." "I don't understand." "Edmund Cross, your landlord. According to the master calculations, he was scheduled to die of a heart attack on November 23rd, 8 days after your recorded date. The temporal proximity allows for what we might call bureaucratic substitution. He will die in your place on November 15th, and you will live to serve a far more important purpose." "What purpose?" Death placed his cold hand on my shoulder, and when he leaned close to whisper in my ear, his breath carried the scent of old flowers and freshly turned earth. The words he spoke next drained all colour from my face and sent me collapsing among the graves, my mind reeling from implications I wasn't prepared to accept. "You will become my representative in the mortal realm," he whispered, "a shepherd who guides souls towards their appointed times, a collector who ensures the ledger remains balanced. The contamination you've experienced was not an unfortunate side effect, it was preparation. You are being transformed into something between life and death, capable of existing in both realms." I tried to object, to refuse this terrible promotion, but darkness claimed my vision before I could form the words. I woke in my own bed the following morning, alive but fundamentally changed in ways I was only beginning to understand. My skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality that made me appear slightly faded, as if I weren't quite as solid as I used to be. My reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed unstable, shifting between my familiar features and something subtly different, older, colder. Marked by knowledge I didn't remember acquiring, sirens wailed outside my window, their urgent chorus cutting through the morning stillness. Edmund Cross had been found dead in his favourite armchair, slumped forward as if he had simply fallen asleep while reading the morning paper. The paramedics' estimated time of death at approximately 3:17 a.m. The exact moment my father had died 29 years earlier. The police attribute Cross's death to a massive heart attack brought on by his advanced age and the stress of managing rental properties, but I knew the cosmic truth behind his passing. On my nightstand lay a piece of aged parchment that definitely hadn't been there when I went to sleep. The paper felt ancient under my fingers, and the words written across its surface appeared to have been inscribed with genuine quill and ink. "The substitution is complete and your service begins immediately. Others will come to you as their appointed times approach. Souls whose departures require delicate handling, whose resistance to fate creates temporal disturbances. You will guide them toward acceptance, ease their transitions, and ensure the ledger remains properly balanced. This reprieve from your own death is not permanent. It is conditional upon faithful service to the cosmic order. Fail in this duty and your original appointment will be reinstated." I understood then that my midnight conversations with death had been an extended job interview, and I had been hired for a position I never applied for. I was no longer fully human, but I wasn't dead either. I existed somewhere between the two states, a cosmic civil servant tasked with maintaining the boundary between life and whatever came after. The transformation became more apparent over the following weeks. I returned to work at the library, but my relationship with the mortality records had changed completely. When I touched death certificates now, instead of seeing mere bureaucratic documentation, I could perceive the stories they contained, the final moments, the emotional residue, the network of connections each death created or severed. I could sense which deaths had occurred according to their proper schedule, and which represented irregularities requiring correction. My hands no longer caused documents to crumble. Instead, they seemed to preserve whatever I touched, as if my contact imbued ordinary paper with a kind of sacred durability. Winston, who had fled from me in terror just weeks earlier, now approached with obvious reverence, purring whenever I entered a room, and following me through the library stacks like a familiar spirit. The memorial garden behind the library revealed the most dramatic change. The flowers and plants that had withered at my approach before death's visit now flourished with unnatural vitality whenever I walked among them. Roses bloomed out of season, their petals an unusually deep red that reminded me of freshly spilled blood. The grass grew green and thick beneath my feet, creating a perfect trail that marked every path I had taken through the garden. But the most significant change was the visitors who began appearing at my apartment. Not at 2:46 a.m, that time remained reserved for death's occasional progress reports, but during the hours between sunset and dawn, when the boundary between worlds grew thin and souls approached their appointed transitions. The first was Mrs. Chen's widowed husband, Mr. Chen, though I quickly realized he couldn't see me in any conventional sense. He wandered through my apartment building at night, calling his wife's name and searching for something he couldn't identify. When I approached him in the hallway outside his door, he looked directly through me, but his agitation visibly decreased. I found that by speaking softly about acceptance and the natural order of loss, I could calm his restless spirit and guide him toward peaceful sleep. Next came a young man named David Morrison, 23 years old, who appeared in my living room on a Thursday night in December. Unlike Mr. Chen, David could see and speak with me directly. He had been scheduled to die in a car accident the following weekend, but his soul was resisting the approaching appointment with such force that it was creating temporal ripples affecting other destinies. "I'm supposed to propose to my girlfriend on Christmas Eve," he told me, his form flickering slightly as he spoke. "I've had the ring for months. We've talked about starting a family, buying a house, growing old together. How can I just accept that none of that will happen?" I spent 3 hours that night explaining the cosmic necessity of scheduled departures, the way individual deaths served the greater tapestry of existence, the peace that came with surrendering to forces larger than personal desire. By dawn, David had achieved the acceptance necessary for his transition, and he faded from my apartment with the expression of sad but genuine serenity. The visitors came more frequently as winter deepened. A middle-aged woman whose cancer was entering its final stages, but who couldn't stop fighting for just a few more months. An elderly man whose heart was failing, but who refused to die before seeing his grandson graduate college. A teenage girl whose depression had reached critical levels, but who was terrified of the permanence of suicide. Each required different approaches, different conversations, different kinds of comfort. I developed techniques for these consultations, drawing on my decades of experience with mortality records and my newfound understanding of death's cosmic purpose. Some souls needed rational explanations, detailed descriptions of how their deaths would serve the greater good, prevent greater suffering, or maintain essential balances in the universal order. Others required emotional support, reassurance that their loved ones would eventually heal, that their lives had possessed meaning and value, that death was not an ending, but a transformation. The most difficult cases involved souls whose scheduled deaths would cause significant trauma to others. Parents of young children, spouses in loving marriages, pillars of their communities whose loss would create ripples of grief and disruption. These souls required the most delicate handling, hours of conversation about sacrifice, duty, and the sometimes cruel mathematics of cosmic justice. Not all of my visitors achieved peaceful acceptance. Some souls fought their appointments with such ferocity that they created temporal storms, disrupting the scheduled deaths of others and requiring direct intervention from Death himself. On those occasions, Death would appear in my apartment outside our usual schedule, his presence filling the room with cold authority as he collected the resistant soul by force rather than persuasion. "This is why your role is so essential," Death explained after one particularly difficult force collection. "Willing acceptance creates harmony in the transition between realms. Resistance creates chaos that affects countless other destinies. You serve as a buffer, transforming potential discord into peaceful resolution." By spring, I had guided over 40 souls toward their appointed times. My apartment had become a way station between life and death, a place where the terrified and resistant could find comfort and understanding in their final hours among the living. The building's other tenants began reporting strange sensations, feelings of peace and acceptance that washed over them during the night, dreams of deceased loved ones offering comfort and guidance, an inexplicable absence of fear when contemplating their own mortality. Death's visits became less frequent but more substantial. Instead of brief midnight conversations, he would sometimes spend entire nights in my apartment, sharing stories from his eternal work and providing guidance for particularly complex cases. I learned about the vast bureaucracy that governed mortal existence, departments responsible for calculating optimal death times, cosmic auditors who identified scheduling errors, celestial administrators who managed the paperwork of universal transition. "You have become one of my most effective agents," Death told me during one of these extended visits. "Souls guided to acceptance through your counseling create smoother transitions than those collected through standard procedures. The cosmic efficiency ratings for your region have improved by 37% since you began this work. How long will I continue in this role?" "Until the ledger determines that your debt has been fully repaid through service. Based on current productivity metrics, I estimate approximately 43 years of active duty remain." The prospect of 4 decades serving as Death's counselor should have terrified me, but instead I felt something approaching satisfaction. For the first time since childhood, my life had clear purpose and meaning. I was helping souls find peace in their final moments, easing transitions that might otherwise be traumatic, serving a function in the cosmic order that genuinely mattered. My work at the library continued, but it had become a cover story for my real vocation. I maintained my cataloguing duties, but my true focus was on identifying potential problem cases, individuals whose deaths might require special handling, souls whose resistance to their appointed times could disrupt the greater harmony. The mortality records provided early warning systems, patterns that allowed me to anticipate difficult transitions and prepare appropriate interventions. On quiet nights when no souls required guidance, I would sit in my kitchen and write detailed reports on my cases, documentation that Death assured me was carefully reviewed by the cosmic administrators responsible for improving transition procedures. Each report included the soul's name, their scheduled departure time, the specific resistances they exhibited, the counseling techniques that proved most effective, and recommendations for handling similar cases in the future. Winston had become my unofficial assistant, demonstrating an uncanny ability to sense approaching souls hours before they appeared. He would position himself by the front door and wait patiently, his purring serving as a kind of beacon that guided confused spirits to my apartment. When particularly traumatic cases arrived, Winston would curl up on their laps or beside their flickering forms, his warmth providing comfort that transcended the boundary between life and death. As my first year of service drew to a close, I realized that my transformation was still ongoing. My reflection continued to fade gradually, and I found I could sometimes see through my own hands when the light struck them at certain angles. Food lost much of its flavor, sleep became less necessary, and the normal rhythms of human existence felt increasingly distant and irrelevant. But I was not becoming death. That role belonged to the ancient entity who visited my apartment and guided my development. Instead, I was becoming something new, a hybrid existence that could serve as a bridge between the mortal realm and whatever lay beyond. The work was sometimes heartbreaking, often exhausting, but always meaningful in ways that my previous life had never been. One evening in late November, exactly 1 year after my original appointment with death had been scheduled, I received a visitor who changed everything I thought I understood about my role and purpose. She appeared in my living room just after midnight, a woman in her mid-30s with auburn hair and intelligent green eyes that seemed to hold depths of sorrow I'd recognized immediately. Unlike my usual visitors, she showed no signs of the flickering translucency that marked souls approaching their transitions. She appeared completely solid, completely present, and completely alive. "You're Thaddeus Mirek," she said, settling into the chair across from my kitchen table, as if she had every right to be there. "I am, and you're here because your time is approaching." She shook her head, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "My name is Elena Vasquez, and I'm very much alive, thank you. I'm here because we need to talk about what you've become and what that means for both of us." I studied her carefully, trying to understand how a living person had found her way into my apartment in the middle of the night, past locks that should have been secure, and through doors I distinctly remembered checking before bed. "I don't understand. You're not the only one, Thaddeus. Death's experiment with human agents has been running for centuries, though most people in your position don't last more than a few months before the isolation and moral weight of the work drives them to madness or suicide." "Experiment?" Elena leaned forward, her expression becoming more serious. "You were told that your case was unique, a rare ledger error that required special handling. That's partially true, but it's not the complete story. The errors aren't accidental, Thaddeus. They're manufactured by Death himself to create candidates for recruitment." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. "That's impossible." He showed me the entry, explained the bureaucratic mistake. "The bureaucracy is real, but the mistakes are deliberate. Death has been systematically creating these errors for over 2,000 years, identifying individuals with the psychological profile necessary for this work and manipulating their cosmic records to force recruitment opportunities." "What psychological profile?" "People who have experienced profound loss in childhood, who have spent their adult lives in close proximity to death and dying, who possess both the emotional resilience to handle traumatic counseling cases and the moral flexibility to accept that individual deaths serve a greater good. People like you, Thaddeus. People like me." I stared at her, my mind racing through the implications of what she was telling me. "You were recruited too. 17 years ago, my father died in a hospital fire when I was 9. I spent my career as a hospice nurse before death came calling with his midnight visits and his talk of ledger errors. I've been serving as his agent in the southwestern United States since 2008. "Why are you telling me this?" Elena's expression grew grim. "Because something has changed in the cosmic order, and Death's agents are being called together for the first time in recorded history. The work we've been doing, guiding individual souls toward peaceful acceptance of their appointed deaths, is about to expand dramatically." Over the next 3 hours, Elena explained the larger context that Death had carefully concealed from me during my year of service. The cosmic ledger wasn't just a record-keeping system, it was an active management tool used to maintain balance in the universe itself. Every death, every birth, Every major life event was calculated to serve specific purposes in a vast equation that encompassed everything from preventing wars to managing natural disasters to ensuring the proper evolution of human consciousness. Think of it as planetary management, Elena said. Death and his counterparts, birth, love, wisdom, suffering, are essentially cosmic engineers, tasked with guiding human development along optimal paths. Individual free will exists, but it operates within carefully maintained parameters designed to prevent humanity from destroying itself or evolving too quickly for the universe to accommodate. And our role in this? We're quality control specialists. When individuals resist their appointed death strongly enough to disrupt the larger calculations, we intervene to restore balance. But recently the number of resistant souls has increased exponentially. People are fighting their destined deaths with unprecedented ferocity, creating temporal storms that threaten the entire system. Elena produced a thick folder from her jacket pocket and spread its contents across my kitchen table. Charts, graphs, statistical analyses, and maps covered in red dots that mark locations of what she called temporal disruptions. The pattern was unmistakable. Resistance to scheduled deaths had increased by over 400% in the past 5 years, with concentrations in major population centres and areas of high technological development. Modern medicine is partly to blame, she continued. People who should have died from diseases or injuries are being kept alive past their appointed times, creating cascade effects that disrupt thousands of other scheduled events. But there's something else happening too. A growing human awareness of mortality that's making people fight death with spiritual and emotional intensity we've never seen before. What does this mean for us? Death is implementing what he calls the final protocol. Instead of individual agents working in isolation, we're being organized into teams responsible for managing entire regions. Mass guidance events, coordinated interventions, systematic counseling of hundreds of resistant souls simultaneously. The implications were staggering. Instead of helping one confused spirit at a time, I would be responsible for guiding entire populations toward acceptance of their mortality. The intimate, personal approach that had made my work meaningful would be replaced by industrial-scale death counseling, designed to maintain cosmic efficiency rather than individual comfort. How many agents are there? Globally, about 300 active operatives, though the number fluctuates as some complete their service terms and others are recruited. Death has been particularly busy with recruitment lately. You're part of a new class of 50 agents brought online in the past 2 years. Elena showed me photographs of some of my colleagues. A former funeral director from Tokyo who specialized in helping souls accept cultural transitions between life and death. A retired medical examiner from London whose technical knowledge made him effective with souls who died from complex medical conditions. A young woman from Sao Paulo who had lost her entire family in a plane crash and developed an almost supernatural ability to comfort grieving spirits. We're meeting in 3 days, Elena said, gathering the documents back into her folder. Death has arranged for what he calls a coordination conference. The first time agents from different regions have gathered since the program began. We'll receive new protocols, updates, procedures, and assignments for the massive intervention operations planned for next year. Where? Chicago. There's an abandoned hospital on the south side that serves as one of Death's administrative centers. We'll spend a week learning about the final protocol and our roles in implementing it. After Elena left, I sat in my kitchen until dawn, trying to process everything she had told me. My entire understanding of my situation, my purpose, and my relationship with death had been fundamentally altered. What I had believed was a unique circumstance born of cosmic accident was actually part of a vast, ancient program of manipulation and recruitment. But as disturbing as these revelations were, I found I couldn't summon genuine anger or betrayal. The work I'd been doing was still meaningful, still necessary, still morally justified by the greater good it served. Whether my recruitment had been accidental or deliberate didn't change the fact that the souls I guided found peace in their final moments, or that my interventions prevented larger disruptions in the cosmic order. If anything, Elena's information made me feel less alone. For a year, I had believed myself to be the only person in the world carrying this burden, the only human being transformed into something between life and death. Learning that I was part of a community, even a community of cosmic civil servants, provided a comfort I hadn't realized I was missing. Death appeared in my apartment that evening for what would be our final private consultation. "Elena has told you about the larger context," he said, settling into his familiar chair with the same patient authority he had always displayed. "She has. Was any of what you told me about the ledger error true?" "Every word. The error in your record was real, the approaching deadline was genuine, and the choice you faced was exactly as I described it. The only detail Elena's information adds is that the error was created deliberately, rather than occurring through random chance." "Why the deception?" "Because willing service is more effective than coerced service. Agents who believe they are paying a debt or fulfilling a cosmic obligation work with dedication and moral clarity. Those who understand they were manipulated into recruitment often struggle with resentment and resistance that undermines their effectiveness." Death paused, studying my face with those ancient, patient eyes. "Are you angry with me, Thaddeus?" I considered the question carefully. Was I angry? The honest answer was no. Disappointed, perhaps, by the deception, but not truly angry. The work I had been doing aligned with my deepest values and utilized skills I had developed through a lifetime of proximity to mortality. Even if I had been manipulated into this role, it was a role I was uniquely suited to fill. "No," I said finally, "I'm not angry, but I would appreciate more honesty going forward." "That can be arranged. In fact, complete transparency will be necessary for the final protocol to succeed. The coordination required for mass interventions demands absolute trust and communication between agents." Elena mentioned meetings, training, new procedures. "Yes, you will be working as part of a team now, responsible for managing temporal disruptions across the entire Midwest region. Your experience with individual counseling will serve as the foundation for developing techniques that can be applied to larger groups." Death stood, preparing to leave, but turned back to face me before disappearing into the shadows between the kitchen and living room. "One more thing, Thaddeus. The service term I mentioned, 43 years, was calculated based on individual workloads. Team-based operations are significantly more efficient. Your actual service commitment will likely be closer to 15 years, assuming current productivity metrics are maintained." And then he was gone, leaving me alone with the realization that my strange new life was about to become stranger still. The trip to Chicago 3 days later marked my first time leaving the city since my recruitment began. I took the train, watching familiar landscapes roll past the window while contemplating how much my perception of the world had changed. The passengers around me appeared subtly different now. I could sense the approaching appointments of those whose times were near, see the spiritual weight carried by individuals struggling with loss or mortality, identify souls who might require guidance when their moments came. The abandoned hospital Elena had mentioned stood on the south side of Chicago, like a monument to institutional decay. St. Catherine's Medical Center had been closed for over a decade, its windows boarded up and its parking lots cracked with the weeds. But when I approached the main entrance at the appointed time, the doors opened smoothly, revealing hallways that were not only intact but immaculately maintained. Inside, the hospital hummed with quiet activity. Men and women who could only be my fellow agents moved through corridors that should have been dark and empty, carrying folders and clipboards, engaged in conversations about quotas and efficiency ratings and temporal management strategies. The building had been transformed into a cosmic administrative centre, complete with conference rooms, training facilities, and what appeared to be a cafeteria serving food that somehow satisfied appetites we no longer technically possessed. Elena found me in the main lobby, studying a directory that listed departments like resistance analysis, mass intervention planning, and spiritual counselling techniques. "Overwhelming, isn't it?" she said with a knowing smile. I felt the same way at my first coordination conference. The scope of the operation is much larger than any individual agent realizes. Over the next week, I received an education in cosmic management that dwarfed everything I had learned during my year of solitary service. The final protocol wasn't just about managing increased resistance to scheduled deaths. It was preparation for what death superiors called the Great Transition, a fundamental shift in human consciousness that would require unprecedented coordination between the cosmic forces responsible for planetary management. According to the briefings we received, humanity was approaching a developmental threshold that occurred roughly every 50,000 years. These transitions typically involve massive population reductions, radical changes in social organization, and evolutionary leaps in cognitive and spiritual capacity. Previous transitions had been managed through natural disasters, plagues, and wars that eliminated surplus population while steering survivors toward new modes of existence. But modern human civilization had developed technologies and social structures that made traditional transition management increasingly difficult. Nuclear weapons meant that wars could destroy the entire species rather than just reducing population. Global communication networks allowed resistant souls to coordinate their defiance of scheduled deaths. Medical advances meant that individuals could survive far beyond their appointed times, creating cascade effects that disrupted the entire cosmic schedule. The Great Transition scheduled for 2087 will be the most complex in human history, explained Dr. Morrison, a former psychiatrist from Edinburgh who served as one of Death's senior administrators. Instead of relying on external catastrophes to manage population and consciousness, we will be using direct spiritual intervention to guide humanity through the necessary changes. My role in this vast undertaking became clear during the specialized training sessions. Along with 49 other agents recruited in the past 2 years, I would be responsible for what the administrators called soft guidance, identifying and counseling individuals whose resistance to their scheduled deaths could derail larger transition plans. We would work in teams of 5, covering regional territories and providing both individual counseling and group interventions as needed. The training covered techniques I had never imagined. Group dream therapy sessions where multiple resistant souls could be guided simultaneously through shared visions. Temporal projection methods that allowed agents to appear to souls days or weeks before their appointed deaths, providing extended counseling periods. Mass suggestion techniques for managing entire populations during crisis events. Even physical manifestation protocols that permitted agents to appear to living humans during emergencies requiring immediate intervention. My teammates were introduced during the final day of training. Marcus Chen, a former hospice worker from Seattle, whose gentle manner concealed remarkable strength in dealing with resistant souls. Sarah Martinez, who had lost her husband and children in a car accident and developed an extraordinary ability to help souls accept separation from loved ones. David Kim, a retired police officer whose experience with sudden violent death made him effective with souls who died in accidents or crimes. And team leader Elena Vasquez, whose 17 years of experience would coordinate our efforts and liaison with Death's administrative hierarchy. "We'll be based in Detroit," Elena explained as we reviewed our territorial assignments. "The industrial Midwest has particularly high rates of death resistance, economic stress, and social disruption. have created populations that fight their mortality with unusual desperation. Our job will be to identify and counsel resistant souls before their defiance creates temporal storms affecting other scheduled events. The work would be more complex than anything I had done individually. Instead of waiting for souls to appear in my apartment, we would actively seek out individuals approaching their appointed times and provide preemptive counselling. We would attend deathbeds, appear at accident scenes, manifest in hospital waiting rooms, and provide guidance wherever the dying needed help accepting their transitions. But we would also handle cases that had previously been managed through direct intervention souls, whose resistance was so fierce that death himself would have been required to collect them by force. Group counselling sessions could often achieve what individual guidance could not, particularly when dealing with souls whose deaths involve family members or close friends also approaching their appointments. The final briefing session included information that chilled even my adapted perspective on mortality. The Great Transition scheduled for 2087 would require approximately 4.2 billion human deaths over an 18-month period, not through war or disease, but through accelerated natural causes designed to appear completely random and unavoidable. Heart attacks, strokes, accidents, sudden organ failures, and dozens of other seemingly natural causes would systematically reduce global population while creating opportunities for consciousness expansion among survivors. The souls departing during the Great Transition will not truly die, Dr. Morrison assured us during the closing ceremony. They will be transferred to alternate dimensional frameworks where their development can continue without the constraints of physical existence. What appears to be death from a human perspective is actually graduation to a higher level of cosmic education. But for those managing the transition from within human civilization, the process would appear to be the greatest catastrophe in recorded history. Our job would be to ensure that the 4.2 billion scheduled departures occurred peacefully, without the kind of resistance that could destabilize the entire process and potentially destroy the species rather than elevating it. I returned to my apartment in Whitmore City with a new understanding of my purpose and a profound sense of the responsibility I carried. The work I'd been doing with individual souls was preparation for something far larger and more significant than I had ever imagined. In 62 years, I would help manage the greatest transformation in human history. But in the meantime, there were immediate tasks requiring attention. My new teammates would arrive within the week to establish our Detroit Operations Center, and the Midwest region already showed signs of increasing temporal instability that needed swift intervention. That night, as I sat in my kitchen reviewing case files and intervention protocols, I realized that my year of solitary service had been the easy part. The real work was just beginning. Winston curled up on my lap as I worked, his purring a comforting constant in a world that had revealed itself to be far stranger and more complex than I had ever suspected. Outside my window, the city slept peacefully, unaware that cosmic forces were arranging the greatest transition in human existence, and that people like me were preparing to guide them through changes they couldn't yet imagine. Death appeared one final time in his familiar chair, but this visit felt different, less like a supervisor checking on an employee and more like a teacher saying goodbye to a student who had outgrown the need for instruction. "Tomorrow you begin the real work," he said, his ancient eyes reflecting something that might have been pride. "Are you ready?" I looked around my apartment at the filing cabinets full of mortality records, at the chair where countless souls had found peace in their final moments, at the simple life I had built in service to forces larger than myself. "I'm ready," I said, and for the first time since this all began, I truly meant it. The story of my recruitment was ending, but the story of my service was just beginning. In the years ahead, I would help guide humanity through its greatest transformation, one soul at a time, until the ledger finally balanced and the great transition was complete. And somewhere in the cosmic bureaucracy that governed all existence, my name would be recorded, not as Thaddeus Mirek, victim of a clerical error, but as Agent Mirek, faithful servant of the universal order, guardian of the boundary between life and whatever comes after. The grandfather clock in my living room chimed 2:46 a.m, one last time as my old life ended and my true calling began.